pleasure to introduce Jennifer Marohasy. Jennifer is a climate change champion and warrior. I went to one of your talks, was it a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, at the Alliance Hotel, and you were presenting all of this information that I didn't quite understand about homogenization of data and so on. And then to see it a year and a half later explode as a national story that the Bureau of Meteorology was getting some of their basic facts wrong, and to see Jennifer have that great win was a wonderful thing to see. So you've got some updates for us, and lots of information on all the forecasting and the whole lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. I would do the forecasting and the whole lot, but you've only given me 20 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do is focus on 3 issues because it has been a little bit of a moving feast. I was talking about homogenization for quite a while, including a year and a half to some in this group. But the issues have really moved on for me, and some people, I guess, well, as late as last night, I was getting an email from the head of the Bureau explaining some of the details with respect to my latest issue. So what I'm going to do is try and cover or outline my 3 issues with the Bureau. And it's not all going to make sense to you, and they are complex and they are technical, but they are important issues. So I'll do my best, and thank you for the opportunity. And I want to explain, because I was asked by Andrew to talk about this issue of the BOMshell and data denial. And the issue of data denial relates to why I have requested 2 temperature data sets for Mildura recently, and why I'm not confident I'm going to get them, but hopefully I will. Provision of this data from Mildura has been neither denied nor provided. Previous similar requests, however, were eventually denied. My 3 issues are the issue of homogenization, the setting of limits on minimum temperatures, and the Bureau not measuring temperatures consistent with calibration. So homogenization is a separate issue to the issue of setting of limits on minimum temperatures, to this issue of whether the temperatures they're currently recording are actually recorded consistent with any worldwide standard. They're certainly recording them in a completely different way to how temperatures are recorded in, for example, the UK and the US, where the standards are very clear and the equipment used is very clear. The first of these issues, homogenization, should have really been investigated through a parliamentary inquiry or an audit about 3 years ago, when Graham Lloyd wrote a series of explosive articles for the Australian newspaper. Instead, we had Greg Hunt, then the Environment Minister, explaining to Tony Jones on Late Line about a year later, specifically on the 24th of September 2015, how he killed the idea of a proper audit because he was confident the Bureau uses hard science, hard data, I'm quoting here, literally millions of points of information through our satellite and local monitoring. That's what Greg Hunt told Tony Jones on Late Line, and of course Tony Jones didn't pick him up on any of that. In fact, the Bureau does not rely on satellite data for any of its temperature data, Australian data. The raw data is almost all derived from electronic sensors within automatic weather stations, with this data subsequently homogenised. Further, in an email that I received late yesterday from Dr. Johnson, we have confirmation that the sensors have been manufactured to the Bureau's own purpose-designed standards. And as yet, these sensors were basically rolled out 20 years ago. We have no documentation explaining how this innovation meets any of the many international standards. Your hand went up.
Yes. Can you explain homogenized?
Okay, that's my first issue, and I'm going to try and do it by way of example. Rather than reporting climate variability and change based on real data, the Bureau remodel original measurements. They remodel the actual measurements from these sensors, okay? And that is in the technical literature all detailed, and it's referred to, it's a technical term, it's homogenization. For example, in the case of Rutherglen, which was what Graham Lloyd reported on in a series of articles in The Australian in August 2014, he explained that because the Bureau say you've got to homogenise data because we have data for here, for example, Cunnamulla you said you're from. They started off recording at the post office and then they moved the equipment to the airport, okay? Using an example that we were speaking about before. And so the Bureau says, well, there's inconsistency, so we have to adjust the post office data, which they often adjust down, to make it consistent with measurements now from the airport. But you can find some places, for example, Rutherglen, we've got a record from 1913 through to the present, a Stevenson screen, which is the standard equipment in which they put the thermometers in the past and the sensors now, recording temperatures in a field, in a paddock, at an agricultural research station in northwestern Victoria. It's never been moved, always with standard equipment, and yet still they adjust down the temperatures. And according to the one of the catalogues, they say that it's because of statistical change. And when I pulled them up on that, they said, no, we actually have moved, the weather station was moved between fields. But then they couldn't come up with any documentation or evidence for that. So you've got examples like Rutherglen that they still haven't been held to account for because Greg Hunt wouldn't let that inquiry go ahead, where they dropped down the earlier record 3 times. So when you get back to the first year of measurement, 1913, there's a whole 1.8 degree difference between the actual recorded measurements for that year in minimum temperature and the homogenised value. That's huge, isn't it?
Centigrade.
Yes, 1.8 degrees centigrade.
Accounts for global warming.
So you're cooling the past, which
1.8 degrees C.
that's the difference between the so the Rutherglen example that I've documented at length, and that Greg Hunt refused to take action on, for example, and any minister since. We have at Rutherglen, they record minimum temperatures and they record maximum temperatures. It's the minimum temperatures that they fiddle most with in that situation. When you take a minimum yearly average for Rutherglen and compare the Acorn SAT, which is the homogenised, with the raw, the difference is 1.8 degrees centigrade. It's huge. And Rutherglen's not unique in terms of this being done. This is done at many sites. In the context of Rutherglen, and I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to actually explain further Bureau justification for that. I'm going to get onto a second issue, and hopefully there'll be questions, time for questions and maybe more clarification, because I am taking questions as we go through. So, issue 2 that I wanted to touch on today was setting limits on temperature minima. I've been complaining for some time about the homogenised Acorn data set, but I assume, for example, at places like Rutherglen and basically across the network, the Bureau was accurately recording actual temperatures, and then it was just remodelling with this homogenisation, and then using the Acorn SAT data set to say that we've got global warming. But it actually was recording correctly the base data. But this winter, I actually was alerted to a couple of things, and I discovered that they've actually been setting limits on how cold a temperature can be recorded. And it was suggested that I was totally absurd to have been suggesting that. And in a letter to the Minister, Josh Frydenberg, on the 28th of July, the head of the Bureau claimed that no limits are set on how cold a temperature can be recorded at any of its 600 automatic weather stations spread across the Australian mainland, though they nevertheless held an internal report and review of that. And when that report came out, it was obvious that he'd written that letter 2 days after I'd been on Sydney radio detailing how I'd worked out backwards how they'd set the limits for Thredbo, and a day before they actually lifted the limits. Now, in the 77-page report, internal report, they didn't say as such that they lifted the limits. What they actually said was that there was, let me get the wording correct, the MSI1 card that had it been inadvertently installed 10 years earlier was removed. So there was acknowledgement that there was a card that was preventing the recording, and I focused on 2 stations, Thredbo and Goulburn, and it was acknowledged that these cards were limiting. But the Thredbo card was in place for 10 years, the Goulburn card for 15 years. When they took, for example, the Thredbo card out, which was limiting the recording of anything under -10, we hadn't had recordings so low for 10 years. 3 days later, we got a -10.9 recording. I mean, it's unbelievable, but it's true, and it's documented at my blog, and I'm hoping that the momentum is building for some proper inquiry into all of this. But my third issue, which is the issue of the calibration, is, I think, the most significant, and it's very much something that, well, I discovered it incidental to trying to work out what they were actually measuring when they were measuring the minimums that they weren't actually measuring, the placing of the limits on the minimum temperatures. Now, while we know, let me try and keep to my notes because this is a bit complicated and I tried to sort it out. While the Bureau, we can see, sets limits on cold temperatures, it's often recording hot days. And I think it was just 2 weeks ago that the news headlines were scary. Sydney, Melbourne urged to prepare for 50-degree days. And you look at the data for Sydney and Melbourne, and for example, I did a plot of days over 35 degrees. Was there an increasing trajectory? It wouldn't actually be that surprising if there was, because unlike that field in Rutherglen, where the local environment hasn't changed very much, Sydney and Melbourne are cities that have expanded. They've grown so much over the last 100 years. More bitumen, more trucks, more air conditioners, more high-rise buildings that block wind. But nevertheless, when you actually look at the data, the hot days, there's no trend of increasing hot days. Rather, there's clusters of really hot days, for example, with Melbourne for that period, because the record for Melbourne goes back to the 1850s, 1860 to 1882. There were clusters of hot days, 43 to 45 degrees days in Melbourne. And then again during the period 1892 to 1908, you get this cluster of hot days. But if you look at the record for Melbourne during much of the 20th century, the really standout hot days were in January 1939, and that summer of 1938-39 was extraordinarily hot in Sydney and Melbourne and in places like Rutherglen. And then you find that there's a spike again in hot days after they moved from the mercury thermometers to these sensors, to these electronic probes in automatic weather stations. And my third issue is whether these probes, sensors in automatic weather stations are actually recording temperatures consistent with any internationally recognised standard. So let me tell you a little bit about these electronic probes. They measure temperatures in a completely different way to mercury thermometers. On a hot day, you're actually getting turbulent streamers of air coming up, and you get pockets of hot air, and you can get fluctuations of 1 to 2 degrees, and this is not disputed with the Bureau, in terms of what might be flowing past a sensor or a mercury thermometer in a Stevenson screen. Now, a mercury thermometer has quite a bit of inertia. It's got a long response time. So a very hot pocket of air is not going to be recorded, okay? Whereas with a sensor, it's got most sensors, the WMO, World Meteorological Organization standard, is that they'll have a response time of just 20 seconds, whereas a mercury thermometer, under the same conditions, has a response time of 107 seconds. So what they've done in the UK, when they've moved from mercury thermometers to automatic weather stations, is they say, we take all the 1 second readings for a minute, so we take 61 second readings. Because there's quite a lot of variability, we then average over a minute. And we get something that's comparable with a mercury thermometer. That's the standard in the UK. And in the US, what they do is they say, we actually think that is too short a period, a minute, and I can answer some questions relating to sort of heat wave studies. They say, what you really have to do, because we've done so much study on this in terms of the specifications for the platinum resistance thermometers, these sensors and everything else, you have to average over 5 minutes to have anything that's comparable with a mercury thermometer, okay? Very straightforward. In the UK, they take 60, 1 second, divide by 60, and they've got their average for the minute. In the US, they do the same but over 5 minutes. Can anybody guess what the standard is for Australia that has never actually been declared until I got excited about this issue about a month ago?
1 second.
1 second.
Oh.
1 second. They take 1 second spot readings. They take 1 second spot readings. And that is not being denied, but you see, what they've done is they've worked out how to put, rather than do things based on the guidelines, what they've done is that they've decided they can modify the sensor so that it actually is averaging. And there's been all this toing and froing and coffees with various people to try and explain that it has been explained by the new head of the Bureau, Andrew Johnson, that you see our sensor actually has a time constant of 40 to 80 seconds, which is longer than the time constants that they're using in the States and the UK, which are all 20 seconds compliant with WMO guidelines. Therefore, it's actually really averaging, so we don't need to average. Except that when you look at the 40 to 80, for example, in his email to me again last night, he's saying that that's consistent with the equivalent for a mercury thermometer. But you look at the textbooks, because all of this is well documented and understood, it's actually 107 seconds. What was explained to me, I got some detail in terms of the sensors, because I've still been assuming that we can actually get the documentation. I asked for the manufacturer's specifications for the sensors that they started rolling out 20 years across Australia. I've been asking for this since the 26th of September, and late yesterday, I got an email, and I'll just quote it a little bit. The Bureau's sensors are purpose designed. They are manufactured to the Bureau's design, not necessarily to the BS 1904/1984 standard, which I'd been led to believe. Specifically, they are housed in a metal sheath which provides thermal mass so that each measurement is an integration over time rather than an instantaneous measurement of air temperature. And he goes on about the 40 to 80 seconds being comparable with a mercury thermometer, which is just not correct. And how this closely mirrors the behaviour of a mercury in glass thermometer, including its time constant. So we've got purpose-designed thermometers that can closely mirror, no documentation to prove consistency with any standard or with how closely this is actually mirroring a mercury thermometer. When the Bureau started claiming record hot days in September for everywhere from Alice Springs to Mildura, I wrote to the Minister asking for parallel data for Mildura, so we could actually, because I knew at that location they'd had for a period the sensors and the mercury thermometers in the same Stevenson screen recording. In the case of Mildura, 11 years. I previously asked for data from Wilson's Promontory for that. This is going back to August 2015. At that time, I didn't ask the Minister. I asked the Bureau directly, and I was told I was going to get the data, and then I never did. This time, I have got Josh Frydenberg taking me and my concerns seriously, which is great, and he's promised that I will get the data, and in the email from Andrew Johnson last night, he has promised again, which is a new for me, that he's promised that I'm going to get that parallel data from Mildura, so we can see how well this non-standard equipment, at least at one location, is performing relative to the mercury thermometers. Thank you.
In midwinter to the far west. Charlotte was there, but then you come down to the road. And I actually had, we were swimming, they were going in the Warrego, and I was off the horse, and I had to swim the rest of the way to get over to the other side in the midwinter holidays. Now, Mum and family were a bit worried that I was quite a good swimmer by that time at school. But sort of, you're talking only on the heat that comes there, but the cold that was down there, that's when everybody, all the school children went to. They never went for a holiday there in summer. We went there in winter.
So I guess your statement is that a lot of places in inland Australia get colder than we think, as well as hotter than we think.
And then I went to another property, and they said, we go across the Warrego, and the horse I was off, but I could swim well, so I finished the swim and finished up there. And the property was there. That property didn't have wooden floors on the thing, it was a dirt floor on the
So with respect to the issue of the minima, I've been assured that there were two locations that I documented where they were setting limits on minima. One was Goulburn and the other was Thredbo. And the Bureau undertook an internal report of its over 600 automatic weather stations and acknowledged that there were limits set at Thredbo and Goulburn, but nowhere else could they find any evidence for limits having been set, though there was not and has not been an independent audit of anywhere else.
So they're not the minimum.
Alright, so I've got a few. So we've got a question here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the other day, as you know, on the Sunshine Coast, it was the hottest ever in the airport. And mine is an environmental scientist, it was 28 degrees and they had 34. Then you go to Pelican Golf Course, they have a heat thing underneath the restaurant. I drove there, it was 28 degrees, you look at the thing underneath the restaurant, Pelican Golf Course, 35. So, you know, like, it depends where you put it. Like you said before.
But there's a whole lot of standards that relate to all of this. And while they can get the standard wrong and you think they'd correct it, the reality is they're not actually working to any standard at the moment. And it's just appalling. And this data, of course, Australia's a large landmass. This data, the problems probably started at least 20 years ago, and all of this data for 20 years has been feeding directly into the NASA and HADCRUD temperature series that inform the RPCC deliberations.
And, Sydney, August was the coldest.
We've got a few.
It was the coldest day since 1862 this year.
We've got a question over here.
Have you ever considered getting a sensor of your own and placing it near one of theirs?
Well, actually, yes, we're looking to do a whole project on that, and I think probably the introduction to my reply, to the reply is, can we please have one of these purpose-built sensors so we can actually do some proper testing of it. We have to do that. We have to move from thinking that they're going to do this correctly to just doing it and setting up our own network.
Or getting one of the American or British sensors.
We've got a question in the back, Ross Kennery. Sorry, and then we'll come to you.
Sorry, I'm just wondering, like, I accept that this data is being pretty systematically homogenised or tampered with, but I'm interested, do you have a view about the culture inside the organisation?
Okay, well, I know this is being recorded, and I have already put it on record that, and he is a co-author of one of the original reports that was looking at what needed to happen with the rollout of the sensors. This is David Jones. He was involved in all of that. He's currently still the head of climate monitoring, and I'm not whatever sure what. He's a senior manager within the Bureau. He features very heavily in the ClimateGate emails, where he says that climate change is so rampant in Australia we don't actually need data. This is in emails that he wrote that are publicly available and have been since ClimateGate 2009. Okay, but this fellow continues to be exceedingly influential in that organisation. And I guess the culture. I suspect that there's a lot of people within the Bureau who are really trying their hardest to do the right thing, but I also suspect that within the Bureau, and David Jones has written so many op-eds for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald explaining that the new climate norm is endless drought. He was writing that just before Brisbane flooded. This is a person who has a particular perspective, and it's reflected in the Bureau's data.